The morning sun had just begun its climb, casting a soft, golden light over the quiet neighborhood. Birds chirped in harmony, and the air smelled of fresh dew and distant coffee brewing. On the corner of Maple Street, a young girl, no older than 12, stood clutching a tattered backpack. She was on her way to school, the weight of her books far lighter than the weight of her thoughts. She had seen him before, the older man with a weathered face and slow, measured steps, though they never exchanged a word. Today was different. The old man shuffled down the sidewalk, gripping a cane that seemed too fragile to hold his unsteady frame. His jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, and his shoes were worn, soles nearly paper thin. Each step looked like a struggle, but his face showed determination, almost as if he were in a silent race against time. The girl's eyes darted between her watch and the man, who was now stopped near the curb, glancing up and down the street as if unsure how to cross. Cars whizzed by, and his hesitation grew. She was already running late, but something tugged at her heart, an ache that refused to let her move forward. A soft voice inside her whispered, "Go help him." She hesitated. Would he even want her help? People often told her to mind her own business. Besides, what if she embarrassed him? She didn't want to intrude. Yet, as she watched him, swaying slightly with the effort to stand still, she couldn't shake the feeling that he needed her. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the street toward him. "Excuse me, sir?" she called gently, her voice careful, almost timid. The man turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was a moment of silence, just a heartbeat long, but in that moment, she saw something in his gaze. It wasn't just the struggle of old age, it was something deeper, something sadder. "Yes?" His voice was hoarse, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Do you need help?" I can walk with you." She held out her hand, not sure if he'd accept it. For a second, he didn't move. The world seemed to pause around them, the cars, the birds, the ticking clock. Then, with a slight nod, he reached out. His hand trembled as it met hers, the skin cool and rough like bark, but there was a surprising strength in his grip. As they began to cross the street together, the girl noticed the slightest hint of a smile on his face. She couldn't tell if it was gratitude or relief, or maybe a little of both. Step by step, they made their way to the other side, and when they reached the curb, he stopped again, his breathing a little heavier now. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You're welcome." She smiled up at him. "Are you going somewhere?" "I can walk with you if you need." The man hesitated, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. His eyes, however, told a story of loneliness, of longing, of something left unsaid. Finally, he murmured, I'm trying to get to the park." "Oh, that's not far," she said brightly, her own nervousness fading. "I can take you there." And so, the two unlikely companions set off together, one step at a time. The girl talked, filling the silence with light chatter about school and her favorite songs. The man listened, occasionally nodding, though his mind seemed elsewhere. As they reached the park entrance, he paused again, looking out at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. For the first time, he seemed to relax, his shoulders softening, his grip on the cane loosening. "Thank you," he said again, but this time, his voice was steadier, stronger. Before the girl could reply, he added, almost to himself, "I used to come here with my wife. She loved this park." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. The girl's smile faltered as she realized there was more to this man than she had imagined. "What happened to her?" she asked softly. The man turned to her, his expression unreadable. But before he could answer, a sudden noise shattered the quiet, a car horn blaring in the distance, followed by the screech of tires. Both of them turned toward the sound, their conversation forgotten as the world seemed to rush back to life around them. What they saw next would change everything. The sound of the car horn echoed through the air, sharp and jarring. The girl instinctively flinched, her eyes darting toward the street beyond the park entrance. The old man stiffened beside her, his grip tightening around the worn cane as he followed her gaze. A car had stopped abruptly in the middle of the road, its driver gesturing angrily at a cyclist who had swerved too close. The moment passed quickly, and the traffic resumed, but the tension lingered like an uninvited guest. The girl exhaled, her heart pounding. "That scared me," she admitted, glancing up at the old man. He didn't respond right away. His focus had shifted back to the park, his expression distant again. It was as though the commotion had only briefly pulled him out of his thoughts before he retreated back into them. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softer now. He blinked, as if waking from a dream. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Just memories." They stood there for a while, the silence growing between them. The girl shifted her weight from one foot to the other, unsure what to say next. She wanted to ask more about his wife, about the story that seemed to weigh so heavily on him, but she didn't want to push too hard. She had learned that sometimes, people needed time before they could share their truths. The old man finally broke the silence. "It's been years since I came here," he said, his voice low and reflective. "Too many years." The girl tilted her head, curious. "Why not?" "It's a nice park." He chuckled dryly, though there was no humor in the sound. "It used to be," he replied. "For me, anyway." It was her favorite place. She'd sit on that bench over there, under the big oak tree, and watch the world go by. She always said the world felt softer here, like it moved a little slower. The girl followed his gaze to the bench he had mentioned. It was empty now, the wood weathered and faded with time. She tried to picture the woman he was talking about, sitting there with a warm smile and kind eyes. "What was she like?" she asked gently. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, though it was tinged with sadness. "She was everything," he said simply. "Smart, funny, kind. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered." And her laugh. He paused, his voice catching. Her laugh could brighten the darkest day. The girl nodded, her own heart aching for someone she had never met. "She sounds amazing." "She was," he said quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The girl could feel the weight of his sorrow, but she also sensed something else, an unspoken gratitude that she had taken the time to listen. She wanted to do more, to help him somehow, but she didn't know how to fix the kind of pain he was carrying. "Do you want to sit down?" she offered, gesturing toward the bench. The old man hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "I think I would." They walked together to the bench, the girl staying close in case he needed support. When they reached it, he lowered himself onto the seat with a small groan, his movements slow and deliberate. The girl sat down beside him, her feet swinging slightly above the ground. For a while, they just sat there, watching the world go by. The park was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing. The girl glanced over at the man, wondering what he was thinking. She wanted to ask more questions, but she didn't want to break the fragile peace they had found. After a long silence, the old man spoke again. "I never thought I'd come back here," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not after she was gone." The girl looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "Why not?" He sighed, his gaze fixed on a spot in the distance. "It was too hard," he said. "Every corner of this place reminded me of her. Every sound, every smell. It was like she was still here, but I couldn't reach her. It hurt too much." The girl nodded slowly, trying to understand. "But you came back today," she said. "Why?" The old man didn't answer right away. His hand tightened on the cane, his knuckles turning white. Finally, he said, "I don't know. Maybe it's because I didn't want to forget. She wouldn't want me to forget. The girl's chest tightened. She wanted to say something comforting, something that would make him feel better, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand on his, giving it a gentle squeeze. The man looked down at her hand, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You're welcome," she replied. They sat there for a while longer, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable. The girl felt a sense of connection with the man, as though their lives had briefly intertwined in a way that neither of them had expected. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she was glad she had stopped to help him. What she didn't realize was that their story was only just beginning. The breeze picked up, rustling the branches of the trees overhead. The old man shifted slightly, his back hunched against the bench as if the weight of the years on him had grown unbearable once more. The girl noticed how his shoulders seemed to droop even more now, like he was carrying something heavy, something invisible, but very real. She couldn't help but feel that his sorrow was too deep, too powerful to be fixed by a simple conversation, or even by just sitting beside him. Still, she stayed there, her presence a quiet comfort, even if she wasn't sure what he needed or if there was anything she could do to help. The park around them seemed so peaceful, yet there was a growing sense of unease she couldn't shake, like something was on the verge of happening, just out of reach. The man's voice broke through the quiet again, softer this time, as though the words had taken years to surface. "I should have done something more," he muttered under his breath, so low the girl almost didn't hear him. She turned toward him, her heart picking up pace. "Done more? Done more for what?" He didn't answer immediately, his eyes lost in the distance again, as though something had drawn his thoughts far away. The girl waited, unsure if he even realized he had spoken. And then, finally, he exhaled, long and shaky, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding for years. "I never told her how much I loved her. Not enough. Not when she was still here." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, and the girl could see the pain flash in his eyes. "You don't think about those things until it's too late." She wanted to say something to comfort him, something to make it all better, but she knew the truth. There was no easy answer to the kind of pain he was carrying. The best she could do was listen, so she did, her heart aching for him. He fell silent for a long time, the weight of his confession hanging in the air like a thick fog. The girl didn't know what to say. How could she possibly understand what it felt like to lose someone you loved so deeply? She was too young for that, but she couldn't help but feel that his regret was somehow wrapping itself around her as well. Finally, the man sighed, rubbing his hand over his face as if trying to brush away his thoughts. "I thought time would make it easier. That I'd forget the pain. But you don't forget. It changes you. It becomes a part of you, something that's always there, lurking in the background." "I'm sorry," she whispered, not knowing what else to say. The man turned to her, a soft smile tugging at his lips, though it was fragile, like it could break at any moment. "Thank you for listening," he said, his voice steady now. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if I could have saved her. If I could have done something different." "Saved her?" The girl frowned, unsure of what he meant. But before he could answer, a sudden noise from across the park startled both of them. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the hum of the distant traffic. But then it grew louder, clearer, a series of harsh, shouted words that echoed across the empty space between them. The girl turned toward the sound, squinting into the distance. A man was standing near the park's edge, waving his arms in agitation, his voice rising with each passing second. The old man tensed beside her, his face growing pale. That's him," he muttered under his breath, almost too quietly for the girl to hear. She turned back to him, confused. "Who?" The old man's gaze was fixed on the figure in the distance, his eyes wide with something like panic. "My son," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The girl's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen anyone else nearby, but now that the old man had spoken, she could see the man clearly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked angry, furious, even. His face was flushed, his fists clenched at his sides as he paced back and forth. For a moment, the girl was uncertain what to do. She had seen people argue before, but this felt different. There was something sharp, something unresolved in the air that made her feel like they were intruding on a deeply personal moment. The old man's body had stiffened, and his hand shook slightly, as though he were trying to decide whether to stand or stay seated. He never visits, the old man said, his voice low and strained. Not since. Well, not in a long time. I didn't expect him to come today. The girl could sense the tension rising between them, the words unsaid hanging in the air. She didn't know what the old man's son had to do with any of this, but the conflict was undeniable now. She turned her gaze back to the angry figure in the distance, who was still shouting, though the words were lost in the wind. What's going on? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. The old man's eyes were filled with a kind of helplessness that sent a chill through her. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the man approaching them. The girl felt the air shift, as though something was about to happen, something important, something that would bring all the tension to a head. The son was almost upon them now, his angry strides quick and deliberate. As he got closer, the girl could see the lines of frustration etched deep into his face, the same lines that seemed to mirror his father's own weariness. You never answer my calls, old man. The son barked, stopping just a few feet away from them. I've been trying to get in touch with you for weeks. What's going on with you? Why are you always avoiding me? The old man didn't respond right away. He just sat there, looking up at his son, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. I'm not avoiding you, he said quietly, his voice shaky. I just don't know what you want anymore. The son's face twisted with frustration. What do you mean you don't know? I want to know why you haven't come to see me, why you shut me out. You think I don't care about you? I'm still your son, but you. The girl shifted uncomfortably on the bench, watching the scene unfold before her. She wasn't sure what to make of the argument, but she could feel the heaviness in the air between them. There was so much that was left unsaid, so much history tangled up in the tension that was now so thick, it almost seemed to suffocate the park around them. The man's voice cracked as he spoke again, his words laced with years of unresolved pain. You don't understand. You never have. The son's anger seemed to rise higher, but the girl couldn't help but notice the subtle tremor in his hands, the way his lips pressed together, as if trying to hold back more than just words. This wasn't just anger. This was something deeper, something that had been building for far too long. As the argument escalated, the girl found herself caught between the two of them, unable to move, unable to look away. What was happening here? What had happened between them? And more importantly, what did it mean for the old man? Questions swirled in her mind, but no answers came. The only thing she knew for sure was that the tension between father and son was far from over, and whatever was about to happen next could change everything. The shouting continued to echo through the park, louder now, as the old man and his son faced off, their words cutting through the quiet of the afternoon. The girl sat frozen on the bench, her heart racing as the tension between them thickened. She could feel the weight of it in the air, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on everything around them. She wanted to leave, to slip away unnoticed, but something held her there, something deep inside, a sense that whatever was happening between these two, it was bigger than just an argument. The son's voice cracked as he shouted again, his face reddening with fury. Why do you keep pushing me away? Don't you care about anything anymore? About me? He stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides, as though he were trying to hold back a storm. The old man's hands trembled in his lap, He looked up at his son, his eyes tired but steady, as though he had already said everything he could say, but the weight of his silence only seemed to make his son angrier. The girl's breath caught in her throat as she watched the scene unfold. It was like watching a train barreling down a track, heading straight for disaster, and she was helpless to stop it. "I care," the old man finally whispered, his voice cracking. "But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to fix us." For a moment, the son stood frozen, staring at his father. The anger in his eyes flickered for a second, replaced by something else, a deep, bitter sadness that seemed to come from a place long buried. But before the old man could say another word, the son spun on his heel and stormed off, his footsteps heavy and quick, disappearing into the distance. The girl sat there, her chest tight, her mind racing. She could still hear the echoes of the argument ringing in her ears. She hadn't expected it to end so abruptly, so violently. But she knew deep down that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There was more to this story, something far deeper than just anger between a father and his son. She felt it in her bones, an undercurrent of unresolved hurt, of years of bitterness and regret. It wasn't something that could be fixed in a single conversation, or even in 100. The old man remained on the bench, his gaze still locked on the spot where his son had disappeared. He didn't move, didn't speak, as if he were waiting for something, waiting for the pain to pass, or maybe for his son to return, to make sense of the mess they had just created. The girl hesitated, unsure what to do. She knew she couldn't fix this, couldn't make it better with a simple word or gesture. But she also knew that the old man needed someone to listen, someone to share this burden with. Taking a deep breath, she slowly moved to his side. She sat down next to him again, but this time, she didn't speak. She simply placed her hand on his, a small gesture that somehow seemed to carry more weight than any words she could say. The old man didn't pull away. His hand felt colder now, as if the warmth had drained out of him. He turned his head to look at her, his tired eyes filled with gratitude and sadness. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough, like he had been shouting for hours. "I don't deserve your kindness. You don't owe me anything." She shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to apologize." They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the sounds of the park fading into the background as they both drifted in their own thoughts. The girl couldn't help but feel that the old man was carrying the weight of something much larger than a simple family dispute. There was something in his eyes, something hidden deep inside that told her he wasn't just grappling with the loss of a loved one. He was fighting with something darker, something far more painful. But what? The answer hung just out of reach, like a secret he wasn't ready to share. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, the old man finally broke the silence. "I haven't told anyone. Not for years," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "Told anyone what?" He closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering the strength to speak. When he opened them again, there was a look of sheer vulnerability on his face. It wasn't just her. It wasn't just losing her that tore everything apart. It was the fact that I couldn't protect her. The girl's heart skipped a beat. Protect her? She had heard the old man speak about his wife with such love and tenderness, but this? This was something different. She didn't know how to respond, how to ask without prying too much. But the question burned in her chest, desperate to be answered. He continued, his voice trembling. "I was there, but I wasn't really there. I couldn't save her when she needed me most. And now it's too late." The girl felt a lump form in her throat, her mind racing with possibilities. What had happened? What had he been too late for? She wanted to ask more, to push him for answers, but she knew now wasn't the time. The old man's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over everything they had just shared. There was something she didn't understand, something he was holding back, and she could feel it pressing down on her chest. Whatever had happened to his wife, it had been far worse than she had imagined. The tension between them, the unresolved conflict between father and son, it was all connected, all tied up in that one painful memory. The girl squeezed his hand again, but she could feel the distance between them widening. He was slipping away, retreating back into that dark place where the past had him trapped, and she was powerless to bring him back. As the evening grew darker, a faint sound reached their ears: footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel path nearby. The old man's head snapped toward the sound, his face paling as if the figure approaching was something he had been dreading. For the briefest moment, the girl thought she saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. She turned her head to see who it was. And then she saw him, the son. He had come back. But this time, it wasn't just anger in his eyes. It was something else, something darker. The girl's breath caught in her throat as the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The real question was not just about forgiveness. It was about what had happened all those years ago. What had caused the rift that had torn this family apart? And could anything be done to heal it, before it was too late? The answer was waiting, but so much still remained in the shadows. The air felt thick, charged with tension as the son approached, his eyes locked on his father, unreadable. But this time, there was something different in his gait, a kind of purpose that hadn't been there earlier. The girl could sense it, the shift in the atmosphere, as if the stakes had suddenly gotten higher. As the son stopped in front of them, the old man looked up slowly, his expression unreadable, a mixture of dread and relief washing over his face. It was as if he had expected this moment for years, but was never quite ready for it. The son didn't say a word at first. Instead, he stood there, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath, as if struggling to keep his composure. The old man shifted uncomfortably on the bench, his hands shaking in his lap. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, the words caught somewhere between regret and apology. The girl, who had been observing the scene silently, felt a sudden rush of uncertainty. Something wasn't right. She could feel it deep in her gut, like a storm about to break. Finally, the son spoke, his voice colder than before. "You don't get to just sit there, pretending everything's fine. You think I didn't notice? You think I didn't see what you did?" The girl flinched at the harshness in his words. She didn't understand what did he mean by what you did. She had been witnessing the father's sorrow and his apparent regrets, but what was the son referring to? She turned her gaze to the old man, who now looked stricken, as if the words had pierced through him in a way that he hadn't anticipated. "What are you talking about?" The old man croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. The son clenched his fists, his face flushed with fury. "You think I don't know? You think I wouldn't find out? I saw it, Dad. I saw it all." The old man's face twisted in confusion. "Saw what? What are you accusing me of?" For the first time, the girl noticed how pale the old man's face had become. His usual frailty seemed amplified now, as though he were physically shrinking under the weight of the accusations. The son's words seemed to hang in the air like a weight, suffocating any hope of a resolution. "Don't act like you didn't know," the son spat. "You can't hide the truth anymore. I found the letters, the pictures. I know what you did. I know what happened to her." His voice cracked with the last word, but there was no sign of remorse, no sign of the pain that might have followed such a revelation. Instead, the words were sharp and full of accusation. The girl felt her stomach twist. What had the son discovered? What had the old man been hiding? The tension in the air was suffocating, and she could barely breathe as the old man's face seemed to crumble beneath the weight of his son's accusations. The girl's heart raced as she tried to piece together what was happening. What truth was this, and why had it been kept hidden for so long? The old man's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't speak. The silence between them stretched on, uncomfortable and agonizing, until the son finally exhaled sharply, breaking it with a low growl. You never told me, did you? You never told me the real reason she left. You never told me how you were responsible. You never told me the truth about what happened that night. The words hit the girl like a slap in the face. The real reason she left? The old man was somehow responsible? She felt the world tilt beneath her feet as everything she thought she understood shattered in an instant. What had happened? What had the old man done or not done to drive a wedge so deep between him and his son? What had caused this family to tear apart so completely? The old man finally opened his mouth, his voice barely audible. I never wanted you to know. I didn't want you to carry that burden too. The son's face twisted in fury. You think I didn't know? You think I didn't see it? I knew. I've always known. It was your fault that she's gone. All of it. And you never had the decency to tell me the truth, to tell me what really happened that night. The girl's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process the storm of words that had just unfolded before her. The truth. The truth about what? She could feel the heavy burden of years of silence pressing down on them both, but the story, whatever it was, remained hidden, just out of reach. Tears welled in the old man's eyes, and he looked away, his face contorting with shame. I should have told you. I should have explained everything. But I couldn't bear to. I thought you'd hate me too. His voice faltered, and he wiped his eyes, the weight of the years pressing down on him more than ever before. The son's anger seemed to give way to something else than a raw, gut-wrenching pain. He stepped closer, his voice shaking. I already hated you. I hated you for leaving me with that empty space, for never explaining what happened. I hated you for making me feel like I was the one who was wrong. The girl's breath caught in her throat as the pieces of the story began to fall into place. The old man had done something terrible. Something that had torn his family apart. Something that had been kept hidden for far too long. But what was it? What had he done to deserve the hatred his son now carried? The air around them seemed to pulse with the weight of the unspoken truth. The old man and his son were standing on the precipice of something, a revelation, a breaking point, and neither of them seemed willing or able to take the next step forward. The son's eyes flickered with a mix of disbelief and rage. You were supposed to protect her. You were supposed to be the one who kept us safe, but you. His voice broke, and for a moment, the anger dissipated, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. You failed her, didn't you? The girl didn't know what to do. She could feel the pain in both of them, but she didn't know where it came from, what it was rooted in. The accusations were so sharp, so cutting, and yet there was something even deeper, something unspoken that she couldn't understand. As the night began to settle over them, the weight of their conversation began to settle in, too. The unresolved tension, the fragmented pieces of a broken family, all leading to this moment. And still, the truth remained just beyond reach, pulling them further apart, threatening to destroy whatever little hope remained. The only thing she was sure of now was that whatever came next would be nothing like what she expected. The truth was too dark, too dangerous to be spoken aloud yet. And the stakes were higher than ever before. What had the old man done? And would the son ever be able to forgive him? Or was their relationship irreparably shattered, a casualty of secrets too painful to bear? The girl sat there, a silent observer, waiting for the next chapter in their story to unfold. The silence that had fallen over them was suffocating, as if the very air had become thick with everything left unsaid. The old man sat with his head lowered, his hands trembling in his lap. The girl watched him, her heart aching for both of them, for the pain they were so desperately trying to hide. The son stood there, his fists clenched, his face a mix of anger and hurt that seemed to ripple through the space between them. And yet, despite the weight of the moment, it felt like they were both still dancing around the truth, unable or unwilling to confront it fully. Finally, the son took a step forward, his eyes never leaving his father. "You think I don't know? You think I didn't see it? I saw the way she looked at you that night. The way she—" His voice faltered, and for a split second, the hardness in his expression cracked, revealing a depth of emotion he'd been hiding for years. He swallowed hard, then continued, his voice low but firm. "She was afraid of you." The words hit like a bombshell, shattering everything the girl thought she knew about this family. She felt a rush of disbelief, as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly disappeared. The old man's face twisted in agony, his eyes closing as though he were trying to shut out the truth, the memory of it. The son's accusation hung in the air, and the girl realized this was the moment. This was the moment when the truth had to come out. The old man finally spoke, his voice barely audible, thick with regret. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of what I had become. I thought if I worked harder, if I made more money, if I did everything right, I could make things better. But I didn't see what was happening in front of me. I didn't see her slipping away. She wasn't just afraid of me, she was afraid of the man I had become. The girl's heart pounded as she listened, trying to understand the depth of the pain that had haunted the old man for so long. There had been no one to hear his side, no one to see his regret. All this time, he had been carrying this heavy weight, not even knowing how to speak of it. His eyes lifted, and for the first time, she saw vulnerability in them, raw, unfiltered, and haunting. "I wasn't there when she needed me," he whispered. "And when she left, I couldn't protect her." A wave of realization washed over the girl, as the fragments of the story began to fit together. The old man hadn't caused the pain deliberately, he had been consumed by his own struggles, by his own insecurities. And in his blindness, he had missed the signs, missed the slow unraveling of the woman he had loved. The guilt that now gnawed at him was more than just the loss of his wife. It was the loss of everything he had built, his family, his relationships, and it was tearing him apart. But the son, standing there with anger still flashing in his eyes, seemed to struggle with his next words. His voice wavered as he spoke again, his anger mixing with an almost desperate need to be heard. "I don't care what you think you didn't see. I don't care what you tell yourself. She left because of you. She left because she couldn't live with the man you were anymore. I've been carrying that for years. You think it's been easy for me? I've been trying to figure out how to survive, how to get by without a father who could see me, who could see anything beyond his own damn work." The girl's chest tightened as she understood the weight the son had been carrying. He had never had the chance to voice his anger, his confusion, his deep, aching need for his father's attention. And now, here they were, trapped in this moment of raw emotion, with the past pressing in from every angle. There were no easy answers, no simple resolutions. But there was something in the way they were finally confronting the truth that felt like the beginning of something new. The old man raised his head, tears welling in his eyes. "I was wrong," he said, his voice shaking with the weight of the admission. "I see it now. I couldn't protect her, and I couldn't protect you either. I failed you both." The son's expression softened just slightly, as though the words had landed where they needed to, though the hurt would never fully fade. "It's too late for apologies now. You've had your chance," he said quietly, the bitterness still lingering in his tone. But even in his anger, the girl could see the cracks in his armor. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was grieving, too. Grieving the man his father hadn't been, grieving the father he had needed but never had. And then, just as the tension between them reached its peak, the old man's voice broke the silence again, quieter than before, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "She didn't leave because of me. She left because she couldn't live with the secret anymore. She couldn't live with what happened. The night. The night I almost lost you both. The words hung in the air like a deadly whisper, and the girl felt her heart stop for a moment. The night. The night he almost lost them both. The truth was darker than she had imagined, deeper than she could have ever guessed. The guilt in the old man's voice was like a knife twisting deeper into raw wound that had never healed. The son froze, his face going pale. What do you mean? What happened that night? The old man took a shaky breath, his eyes distant as he seemed to struggle with the weight of the confession. I was drunk that night. I lost control. I wasn't there for her when she needed me. And when I came to my senses, she was gone. She left me. Left both of us. I didn't understand, didn't know how to fix what I had broken. That's when the walls went up between us. And I never told you, because I was too ashamed. The girl's breath caught in her throat, the enormity of the revelation hitting her like a wave. The old man hadn't just failed in his marriage. He had failed in the most crucial moment, the moment that had torn apart everything they had once known. The son's face was unreadable for a moment, his eyes searching his father's face as though trying to find some sign that what he had just heard was a lie. But then, as if the weight of it finally sank in, his expression softened just smallest bit. I had no idea, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought I was one who failed. But it wasn't just you. It was all of us. The girl felt the room close in around her as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. They had all been carrying the weight of that night, the unspoken guilt and regret, without ever truly understanding the truth. And now, finally, they were face to face with it. But even in this moment of revelation, there was still so much left unsaid. As the old man and his son sat in the silence that followed, a deep, unspoken understanding seemed to pass between them. Neither of them knew how to repair what had been broken. But for the first time, it felt like they were ready to try. And just as the girl was about to stand, to leave them to their moment of raw reconciliation, a sound interrupted the soft, familiar creak of Park Gate. A figure stepped into view. She turned, her heart racing, and saw a woman walking toward them. The old man's breath caught in his throat, and for the briefest moment, the girl saw his face go pale again. The woman approached slowly, her face drawn and tired, but her eyes, those eyes were filled with something she hadn't seen in so long. Hope. The girl's breath faltered as she realized who it was. The old man's wife. And everything, in that single moment, changed. The park felt eerily still as the woman stepped closer, her footsteps soft but purposeful. The old man's hands shook, his heart hammering in his chest, as if the years of pain, regret, and separation had all converged into this one moment. His son remained frozen, eyes wide, his mouth open as if he had seen a ghost. And for a brief second, the girl, who had been quietly observing the whole scene, felt as though time itself had stopped. The woman, her hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with years of hardship, stopped a few paces from the old man. She glanced at him, then at their son, before her gaze shifted to the girl. A small, sad smile tugged at corner of her lips, though it was clear she was equally overwhelmed by everything happening in front of her. I didn't think I'd see either of you here, the woman said, her voice soft, carrying weight of years that had passed in silence. There was a depth to her words, a sense of both wonder and sadness. She seemed unsure of how to proceed, as though she wasn't entirely sure what had brought her here, or whether there was anything left to repair. The old man opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. His chest rose and fell with every shaky breath, his hands clenching into fists. The son, standing beside him, didn't seem to know what to do either. He glanced at his father, then at his mother, a mixture of confusion, anger, and hope fighting for dominance on his face. He had been living with a ghost of a mother, and a father who seemed unreachable. Now, standing before him, was the woman who had left them both, the one he had blamed for the fracture in their family. But as woman stood there, waiting for them to make the first move, something in the air shifted. The old man, trembling, finally found his voice. I never thought I'd see you again, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I've spent so many years regretting what happened, regretting the way everything fell apart. I thought I was the reason you left. That I had driven you away. But I never really understood. I never really understood why. The woman's eyes softened as she took a step closer, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before turning to their son. I didn't leave because of you. I didn't leave because of anyone. I left because I needed to. I needed to find myself again, to breathe. I didn't know how to live with the secrets I was carrying. But I was wrong, and I should have come back sooner. The son, still standing rigid, looked at her with a mix of disbelief and anger. You left us. You left me, he said, his voice shaking. I spent all these years thinking it was my fault. I thought I did something wrong. And you, he stopped, swallowing hard, his emotions too tangled to express. The woman stepped closer to him, her eyes glistening with tears. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I never meant for you to carry that burden. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone, but in the end, I only caused more pain. I was lost in my own grief, and I didn't know how to help myself, let alone help you both. The son's eyes flickered with pain, and the girl could see the conflict within him. Part of him wanted to shout, to accuse her of abandoning them, but another part of him was desperate to believe that there was more to the story. That it wasn't just a matter of her leaving, but something deeper, something neither of them had fully understood until now. I don't know if I can forgive you, the son whispered, his voice barely above a whisper, his head hanging low. I don't know if I can just forget everything, forget the years of wondering why. The woman's expression crumpled, as if the weight of her son's words hit her harder than anything else could. She nodded slowly, her voice breaking as she spoke. I understand. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I don't expect it. But I want you to know I never stopped thinking about you both. I never stopped loving you. The girl, standing quietly to the side, felt the full force of the emotional storm that was unfolding. It was a moment that felt both devastating and healing at the same time. The past had a way of holding on to people, of wrapping its arms around them and refusing to let go, but for the first time in years, the woman seemed ready to let go of the past, to embrace the present. For a long while, there was only silence as the three of them stood there, each of them carrying their own pain, their own scars. And yet, amidst the pain, there was a glimmer of something else, something that felt like hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could begin to rebuild. The old man finally broke the silence. I've spent so many years thinking I had lost you, he said, his voice hoarse. But maybe I've just been holding on to the wrong things. Maybe it's time for all of us to let go of the past. The woman reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his arm. I don't know if we can ever fully let go of the past, but maybe we can start fresh. Maybe we can start healing. The son looked between them, his face still set in a hard expression, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps acceptance, beneath the surface. It was a long road ahead, and they all knew it. But for the first time in a long time, they were facing it together, standing in the middle of the mess they had made, ready to try to find their way back to one another. The girl watched them in silence, feeling as though she had witnessed something profound, something that could never be fully explained, only felt. She had come into their world by chance, a stranger observing the unraveling of a family. But somehow, she had become a part of it, a silent witness to a story that, while painful, was also one of hope and healing. As the park began to empty out, and the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, the woman, the old man, and their son stood there together, talking quietly, exchanging tentative smiles. The girl couldn't hear their words, but she didn't need to. The raw emotion that had once hung between them like an insurmountable wall was slowly being chipped away, one word, one moment at a time. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. The girl turned away, stepping quietly out of the park, leaving them to find their way forward. She knew their journey was just beginning. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a story of destruction. It felt like a story of rebuilding, of learning to forgive, of understanding the pain that had shaped them all. As she walked away, a thought lingered in her mind. Sometimes, the hardest things to face were the things that had been hidden for so long. But in facing them, something miraculous could happen. People could find their way back to each other, no matter how broken they seemed. And perhaps that was the most beautiful part of all, the chance to start anew, no matter how many years had passed. No matter how deep the wounds. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.